So we can move on to the business of the afternoon properly. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Jenni Case. Now, Jenni's been here all week. I hope she's had a nice time. We've certainly enjoyed her being here. And she and Bob, I think as Paul said, were part of our Visiting Scholars Week. So it's a real pleasure to be able to welcome her. She's from the University of Cape Town. From the Centre of Research in Engineering Education. I can now look at this. I've got it written down, but I can read that as opposed to what I've jotted down. And her particular interest is in the learning process. And I guess you could say it's kind of learning close up. That's a sort of from a Hecko-ish type thing to say. So I'd like to hand over to Jenni to take it on from here. Rethinking student learning from a social realist approach. So, Jenni.
Mary, thank you very much. And thanks to Mary, Paul, colleagues here for the invitation. It's been wonderful, really lovely experience to live in a department for a week. And especially to come to Lancaster, which has been very significant in my research life because I just finished my PhD where I came to this conference called HECU. And I was quite blown away. I will say I spent that first conference thinking I was doing completely the wrong thing. Everybody was doing stuff that was really interesting, but particularly that close-up connection. And I think the way that conference, I've come to now realize, was an expression of something about how things work here in this department as well. Very collaborative, very interactive, and I think today's program also expresses that. So thank you very much. Just to explain the weirdness of my departmental location, because it's very odd to have a higher education research in the Department of Chemical Engineering, and it is now, it feels like a 20-year participant observer experiment I've been part of. But it's part of academic development, particularly at UCT, that we do have a very large group of academic development, higher education research colleagues in a central unit. But then we also have people so-called embedded in departments, and that's been a really interesting place to do quite a lot of my research in, but also my work around academic development. So that's just to explain that. And then another sort of, where am I coming from? So in trying to encapsulate this quickly, that's just a screenshot of myself busy Googling some images of Cape Town. And I actually thought, when I saw that whole screenshot, I thought that's precisely shows the kind of stark contradictions of the context where I live, and the contradictions which are the heart of the university as well. The first picture with a toilet in a backyard, well, that's a place with a flush toilet, and 20 minutes from the university, it's terrible to say, there are places where people don't have access to the most basic human needs. Moving along, but there as well, the sort of sandy Cape flats. But then there are the images that you may associate with Cape Town as well, you know, the tourism and the lovely food and all that. And I guess that shapes a lot of my work and a lot of my thinking around student learning. And so it's also been really nice to connect with colleagues here who have that social justice framing for thinking around education. So to try and knit what I'm doing together with what happened this morning, you know, Paul and I are doing this practice bit and you had a policy bit, but obviously the whole thing is to try and see how they talk to each other. And if I would talk about higher education policy in South Africa, it would take a whole session. So I'm not going to do that. But just to sort of really link that policy around publicly funded higher education is obviously predicated on some kind of idea of what the purposes of higher education are. Why society, not only states, but taxpayers through states, invest massively in these institutions that only some proportion of the youth cohort attend. And why should that investment be justified? And I guess, you know, to link to the talks this morning, we all know how that discourse has become quite dominated by human capital theory, and it has a particular form if you look in the emerging economy context, you know, that of course we're producing these knowledge workers, these highly skilled people who are going to go and drive the economy and also get individual benefits from that. But and of course, you know that in this context, there's now increasing questions around the graduate premium. I think it's really important in South African context that we're also unpacking this a bit. So we do have in our higher education policy a very explicit understanding that higher education also needs to deal with the legacy of the past. But how exactly that happens and what exactly the roles are that graduates are considered to take when they go out into society, I think we have theories around that, but not necessarily the kind of empirical data will support that. So, and that's my institution, by the way. Come and visit someday. So, yeah, so that's the link. The link to the policy is, I guess my question is, what empirical data informs the policies that we have, and how can we justify and maybe better plan what we think higher education is all about? So just to give you a little bit more details, and this is quite interesting with regard to Bob this morning, how numbers are now constituted in the way we think about systems. And these kind of numbers, there's no South African higher education person that can't reel off all these numbers for you in all their accuracy. You can also see the constituting of people into groups, and something of an irony that we've kept the apartheid era racial legislation, but understandably needing to track inequities and how they continue. So you can see on average we enroll, if you take the standard measures, 18% of the youth cohort. Compared to the rest of sub-Saharan Africa, that's quite high. Much more like 6%, I think, is the average across the continent. But if you split it up across different racial groups in South Africa, if you look in here at South African students, which of course are not the whole student body, there's some very massive disparities about participation. An accompanying really important perspective is also to look at success. And again, interesting to see this. We didn't have the capacity to have these kind of national stats until quite recently. And it has been really important. You can't run away from these sort of figures. So we take in a very select group of students, and you would think we should do quite well with them. Well, that's the argument of my colleague Ian Scott, and we actually do quite poorly. So our bachelor's degrees, the general degrees, a 3-year degree. You can see only less than a third of students graduate in those 3 years. 37% entirely drop out of the system, and then the remainder take a bit longer. 4-year degrees like engineering, which is the context where I'm based, the numbers are a little bit higher, but still, if you think of the level of school marks you have to get into engineering, I just don't really think that's something that we can consider acceptable. So that is framing a lot of our thinking at the moment, but I'm conscious that that puts your focus on one aspect of things, the sort of efficiency argument, and you can miss actually also some of the other questions. To sort of contextualize this maybe more generally in terms of research in higher education, and here hopefully link to Paul's talk. I mean, my understanding of what we're going to do is the two talks should really talk to each other a bit, or they will. So my view is that we've actually got quite a lot of research around the student experience of learning in higher education. And I mean, that's been my bread and butter for a long time, and a number of key people here as well. And we understand this also, I mean, from South Africa in terms of students from different social backgrounds, and what indeed is lying behind those numbers that I gave you. If we're talking purposes of higher education, then of course we're interested to look at people post-higher education. And so we have these graduate destination surveys, and also increasingly we're getting those kind of statistics, and they are really interesting. But again, they only tell you one sort of thing. They're pretty good at telling you about employment, about earnings, about labor market sectors, and so on. But not much more than that. And of course, you know, there's recognizing huge work around understanding policy. In South Africa, generally, we take the policies that have been a failure in UK and Australia, and then we apply them. It's about 20 years later, usually. So the one advantage is you can find the critical literature and be ready right at the start, you know, before we do whatever outcomes-based schooling or whatever we do. So, yeah, hearing about this teaching excellence framework and thinking we need to get our ducks in the row for that one, because I can see it coming as well. But I guess my argument, and really the purposes of what I want to speak a little bit about today, is that I think we do need more close-up work on people post-higher education. And I'm not meaning to say, of course, there are interesting ethnographies, particularly in the area of studies around people in the workplace, but those that specifically link up with young adults and try to draw that also back to what the experience of higher education was about. I have found less of that than you would think. And I guess the one practical reason is when you're researching students in higher education, they're on your doorstep, you know, even though you've done all the right ethical they're easy and they're usually amenable to interview and so on. It's quite different to track down people in the workplace and so on. So the study I'm going to talk about now is my first attempts really in that direction. So yeah, a quick little ad break. So I thought I'd follow Bob here. I can't say, I was joking the other day, at what point can I say it's my first book? No, this is my book, my only book. But recently, and very much inspired actually also by work here, and particularly Paul's book, which predated that. I see myself as trying to take some of his ideas a bit further. And everything I speak on today is in a lot more detail in there. So if I don't get it out properly. So wait, hey, something's a bit funny there. There's a pic. So the concept I want to put forward to you today is a particular framing of the notion of reflexivity coming from the work of Margaret Archer. And I mean, obviously, Margaret Archer offers you this framework of everything about the social world, and I'm really just zooming in on this one construct. And so she offers a definition, and I'm conscious, obviously, reflexivity has different meanings, especially if we're talking about being a researcher. What does she mean? Regular exercise and the mental ability shared by all people. She actually says all normal people, but then that gets everybody in the audience upset, so I edited myself. To consider themselves in relation to their social context and vice versa. And that latter part gives you the sociological part of it, their structure and agency. So this is Margaret Archer's central construct for how structure and agency have an interplay with each other. And I guess her argument has been is that there have been inadequate theorizations of humans and the way that they deliberate in this way. Maybe, I suppose, a long-standing battle with the notion of habitus, which is a different angle on this. But Archer suggests to us that there really, she talks about, well, it's not only what talks about personal emergent properties, but there are three key things you have as a human being. So self-consciousness is something that all the childhood development people have unpacked, comes very early in childhood and you carry it through. Awareness of yourself, knowledge, which is of great interest to us, and reflexivity. And Archer, in her recent work, she has written a book called The Reflexive Imperative in Late Modernity, and she sort of really made this in a way a central empirical construct. Also the book Making Our Way in the World before then really unpacks this. But now the reflexive imperative, she argues that the current times we're in, and I living in South Africa, this has a particular resonance. She talks about accelerated morphogenesis. So very fast change in society, new conjunctions of structure and culture which interplay with each other, and culture is conceptualized here particularly in Archer's terms as a kind of analogous to structure. Her argument, and here's the sort of anti-habitus argument, traditional guidelines are not adequate to new situations. There's a decline of routine action. And so the exercise of reflexivity has become an imperative. And her argument is that this is the way modern people are having to make their way through the world, is to develop and to have a quite central way, remember reflexivity, deliberating on the world, deliberating on yourself, weighing up things and making a course of action, not being able to just necessarily map things onto the past. I think you will see why this felt to me quite a useful angle for looking at graduates. So, I mean, the classic, the knowledge economy idea is obviously graduates have their knowledge and they go out there and they apply their knowledge in particular workplaces. This is something that actually is a framing that is a little bit larger and I think is an interesting one when we talk about a complicated world where things are not straightforward. So she defines what she terms 4 modes of reflexivity, and the modes will give you now a bit more of a flavor of what these are. And these come out of, okay, I will say, I said to a colleague here, Archer, these are maybe quite a UK thing. She says they're actually Warwick. So this is the point I'll come to. This has really been developed as a framework, but with a group of young people in one location in the UK, and it's been explained to me that Warwick is a very particular sort of one. So I have an interest to see how they work out if we take them into other contexts. So communicative reflexivity I don't want to say is close to habitus because I think I might be slightly conflating things here. But this idea, the internal conversations also Archer sort of construct, which is very obvious in a way what it is. But a communicative reflexive mode is someone who feels they need to externalize their deliberations, get a sort of okay from people around them, and then pursue. And so the classic thing, and her sociological argument is this leads to the notion of staying put. So your classic work evidence that you would have about maybe working class populations where young people would think, maybe I want to study, and then they go to their peers and reason, nah, you don't do that. And then they go, oh, okay, I won't do that. I'm very much simplifying it. But that would be a sort of classic piece of communicative reflexivity, checking out, making sure you do. And this is your natal context that usually offers that. Autonomous reflexivity for Archer is where that internal conversation is actually maintained inside the person. And you deliberate amongst yourself, you decide what you're going to do, and you do it. Obviously, you've got to look at opportunities, constraints. You know, this is not a world where you can be the self-made man or woman and do everything you want. But you figure out this project, you look what's out there, you decide I'm going to do it, and essentially you go off and do it. Meta-reflexivity is really interesting. It's a kind of sideways sag in the whole thing, where here's a definition that the internal conversation is actually quite centered on critically evaluating previous inner dialogues, but especially about society and thinking about action in society. So the difference with the meta-reflexive state is not so much only myself and my little capabilities and what I want to push on with, but a sense of my space in the world, and often related meta-reflexivity to people making what you would classically call the sideways career move. You know, there's someone who goes into something that is intrinsically valuable and their peers might be surprised at, but it's what they decided was valuable to do. And then she has a notion of fractured reflexivity, where quite a difficult and a psychologically troubled situation where you actually can't figure out a course of action. The world impinges on you, you've got these various emotional imports. You may do something or the other thing, but it's not necessarily related in a very clear way to your internal conversation. I mean, what I should make obviously clear here, this is not rational choice theory. So Archer owns very significantly how emotions are in fact your more fundamental way of making decisions as opposed to cognitive deliberation. So that's the little piece of theory that guided the study that I'm going to give you a little bit of a flavor about today. So here's the study. Those are not actually the students. That's just another class, but I give you a sort of flavor of what a chemical engineering class at UCT looks like. Other people in the front row, the lecturers, you can see. The older crowd. So, and this is something that I sort of confessed. One of the downsides of my participant observer job is that this is the main data that I've collected in the last 15 years, post my PhD. And I've had lots of really interesting times taking various slices out of it. This is the final slice, I have to say, and we're starting new data now. But anyway, at the early 2000s, so it was a third-year Chem Eng class. I actually joined the class with the students. I didn't study chemical engineering or chemistry long ago. I mean, the kind of crazy ideas you have early on in your research career, and did 2 interviews with each of 36 students. The class was 45, and 36 of them volunteered, and so we ran with that. And then, and I did a lot of work with very, very rich interviews around their experience as third-year students. 10 years on, I thought, I don't know, I got this crazy idea, let's try and catch up with them again. And of course, LinkedIn made this amazingly easy to do, really. So I tracked down nearly all of them. 30 of them I managed to have a telephonic interview with, and really expanded the study to now have this kind of longitudinal dimension. How are we doing, Murray, on time?
You got 9.
Yeah, I thought you hadn't told me. You were going to tell me 10 minutes.
No,
That's
I was
fine.
just testing your
I had
sense
that
of
feeling.
inner
No,
time.
that's we're spot on. No, that's good.
I was going to give you an extra minute there. You ruined it now.
Oh, no, I've ruined it. Damn it. So just to give you a context, which is was at least partly interesting for me as well. So of the 36 of them, 33 I knew had graduated, and of those 33, they were all working. That was the first really interesting thing. The class was about 40% female, so many of them had gone on maternity leave, come back, whatever. They were all working at the time I interviewed them. 31 of the 33 were working in engineering, which also interested me, and all except 2 were working in Southern Africa. In fact, there was only one who wasn't. One was Botswana and the rest were in South Africa. So that's a very interesting, there's the economic story, which is fascinating, because compared to engineering elsewhere, a lot of people are not going into, still a very resource-based economy, long and short, you know, the history of South Africa. And so the job opportunities for engineering graduates are strong, and that's what's suggested here, even with a little bit of an up and a down. The interviews were running from about 2011, so post financial crashes and things. 2 of the students had not completed the degree, and they were working in sort of business retail, and 1 person I didn't track down. So if I go back then to the modes of reflexivity, and I mean, I did a whole lot of other slices through the data, but I'm just pulling out the reflexivity because I think this is pretty central. It's absolutely striking that there was very little evidence of communicative reflexivity in the study. So I'm talking from when students were even entering the university, because those earlier interviews had traced them, their stories, their narratives about entering the university. And the key thing is that for most, the choice to study at university involved some kind of a break with their natal context. Even if they were students whose parents had had some form of tertiary education, also coming to quite elite institution to engineering was often a very distinct personal project. And clearly this relates to, I've talked about a very fast change in society, and so, you know, many first generation students as well. So that was the clear thing. But I do pull out here, I'm just trying to give you a flavor of the narrative data. So I'm going to give you a particular narrative, which I think gives you a sense of what I mean by communicative reflexivity. And I've got here a narrative of moving from CR to AR, from communicative to autonomous reflexivity. And a student I've called Susan, obviously they're pseudonyms. So she came from a very privileged family, did very well at school, had been advised. She actually wanted to be a teacher, but people said to her, no, you must do chemical engineering because it will open doors. And so she thought, I better do this door opening thing. Very interesting student. At 3rd year, she was the top of the class, but she just had already realized she does not want to be a chemical engineer. She found it boring. She went and did some vacation work. So then her project became, I want to do something else. I want to do management consulting. So in fact, she made sure she stayed top of the class. She got that, and then she actually went on to a very interesting sort of HR type career. And I've characterized that as a shift from communicative to autonomous, that point where she had to actually think, okay, I'm not going to do what other people said. And there's a little quote from Susan. Yeah, she's really enjoying it. She's not the only one who was saying at 3rd year, this is not a very fun degree. Lots of work takes over your life. I can't think outside the chem-eng box. If I move on to autonomous reflexivity, this, as you would expect, and Archer theorized as well, if you're talking engineering studies, this is a very fundamental and almost necessary mode of reflexivity. The need to sustain a personal project that involves dampening of broader desires. And hard, being a 3rd year student, a sort of 20-year-old, and having to grind through all the work when, you know, my students have things they say about humanities students who always sit in, you saw those steps there, the jammy steps. Engineering students don't sit a lot on the jammy step. Interesting was to follow up with people's graduates and to see how autonomous reflexivity then works out in the workplace, well, for someone who's now in the career. Very strong part of the identity, a self-concept, I'm as a responsible person, I'm a problem solver, and really crucially, how they related this to their study experience. So, and these are the kind of these quotes just to give you a little bit of a flavor. I mean, you know, when I interviewed them as 3rd year students, I really I wrote papers around alienation because that characterized very much the sort of way they spoke about it. But now, when they interview them, someone says, I had to fail those 3rd year courses to be the person I am today. I failed the course, I studied too much, didn't go out with my friends. So there's an interesting turnaround. I had to come back, repeat the courses. Life developed a meaning for me. I even started enjoying Cape Town. And I'm claiming this as a way of owning a personal project. Continuing, if I look at how does this work out in the workplace, people very much talk around, because I went through something really hard and I have the confidence to solve problems. I mean, that second quote is so resonated with me. You can give me anything, I can handle it. I don't flinch. I just say, bring it. I've been through hell before. And that is a student who did go through hell with quite a few extra years to get the degree. Moving just quickly on to give you a bit of a flavor of meta and then fractured reflexivity. It was interesting to see some of this starting to emerge, and it's kind of clear we were talking. I'm definitely going to have to track these guys down again in another 10 years because I think the story could continue to be interesting. And this was not a strong prompt in the interview, but there were comments around sustainable development especially, and how they were seeing the engineering workplace shifting and how they're starting to see the responsibility to society. Another thing also was about people making personal choices around their family, around their community. And I took this as an emerging meta-reflexivity. Cyril is an incredibly interesting student. And in fact, Delia Marsh and I myself wrote a whole paper on one student in studies we published on this student who, even as a third year, had a very, very interesting narrative. Came from extremely disadvantaged background, was orphaned, figured out in some point in school, essentially an autonomous shift. He actually said, I was starting to hang out and do a bit of criminal activity, and I realized that was actually a short-term thing. I was maybe academically strong and I could get bursaries and so on. He was really interested as an undergrad engineering student because he rejected the whole thing of I can only study. He said, no, I have to be more involved in broad things at the university. Paid a little bit of a price for it to repeat a year, but went on, and now when I caught up with him, incredibly successful in a big company. So, of course, doing standard engineering work, but interestingly, within the company, taking an explicit role of working with young engineers, and then in community, very much involved in youth work, largely through a sort of church context. So I find that something, and by the way, I think these kinds of stories are very underrepresented in how South Africa thinks about its young people. There's a lot of this. And then just briefly, fractured reflexivity. This has actually come out more of the work of some of my PhD students who've dug up a little bit deeper with this, Linda Cotter's work, also Disa Mogashana's work. This notion of really not being able to make a sensible way forward. And I think this is quite a potentially interesting way of thinking about some students' experience of not succeeding in higher education. So I just offer you briefly, this is the second last slide, Murray, a narrative of someone I've called Cyril, going from a quite fractured space to actually getting an autonomous and arguably even meta-reflexive. Very complicated time while at university, massive impact of family finances, local Cape Town family, but difficulties around work and employment. And this young man having to do engineering and work part-time at the same time. And I knew from the start this is going to not necessarily work out. Carrying on, trying to do a postgrad study, trying to keep his family happy, and there's the quote that really tells you about this person making a decisive shift. I need to break away from the problems at home. It wasn't my issues, my folks. I was taking responsibility as the eldest child. I needed to break away. I need to get married, start a job. He then decided he wanted to do school teaching and is enormously fulfilled as a school teaching. So, of course, stress and tension at home and on campus as well because he dropped out of postgraduate studies in chemical engineering. But I find that a really quite powerful narrative. So really just to say in concluding, this is very much an exemplar study. As I say, I'm quite excited to kicking off. We're starting a project right now where we're going to be following up students across science and arts programs and doing very similar sort of interviews, but hopefully face-to-face. I think reflexivity is enormously a useful framing. I mean, if you look at the book, you'll see that it's got a bigger context. It sounds maybe here a bit like a psychological theory, and it certainly isn't that. Say the methodological challenge on interviewing people post-graduation. I'm quite interested in exploring how do we get to do what we can do in that context. And I do think that more of this work we can start to contribute to a more nuanced understanding of the role of higher education in society. And well, I hope the South would like to speak back to Margaret Archer. So yeah, is there such a thing as a reflexive imperative? And how does reflexivity play out in young people's lives in a context like post-apartheid South Africa? So thanks for your attention. I've got a little photo to thank Lancaster. There's two people in the audience who will recognize themselves. I think that's HECU 2006, Professor Trowler. We all got like darker hair, more hair, something like that.
Well, except Professor Trowler.
Exactly. Every time I see people, they say, your hair's changed colour. I'm like, I didn't plan to. I just took something off the shelf. But that was that was the meeting where we decided to have the next HECU in Cape Town, which was also a really exciting part of my research life. And so just obviously to play all of this work we do within a broader network. There's some of the students I worked with. I'm actually in the picture with some of them, and I've had other colleagues that have really helped out here. So thank you for your attention.
Thanks very much, Jenni. Well, we have some time for questions, so I'll invite questions from the floor.
Yeah. Do you want to introduce yourself, just because I don't know?
I'm Tanya Lewitz-Zabatska from Edinburgh University,
yes.
Looking at student-staff partnerships, but I've been reading a lot of research or work by Marcia Baxter McGolda.
Oh, yeah.
And I've forgotten the
Self-authorship.
Self-authorship,
Yeah.
So I was thinking about self-authorship and reflexivity. And the differences between them and the similarities.
Okay, so the short answer is that I gave a seminar on Monday on this, and it's on video. Where's Rebecca? You can, because indeed, actually, that's so nice that you mentioned that, because I decided the seminar on Monday was about taking different theoretical slices and seeing what comes up. And so I think self-authorship theory is really interesting. What is interesting, because Baxter McGolda is one of the people who's done longitudinal studies, and of the sort with this kind of narrative data. For me, the limitation is not embedded in a sociological, broader understanding. So, for example, they're very surprised that minority students kind of often have quite a lot of self-authorship. I mean, anyone working with a bit of a social framing would not be at all surprised by that, because that's the interaction between the individual and society. And some situations, if you're born into that situation, you have to do a lot of work just to get anywhere. It's a version of autonomous reflexivity. But I think that work is interesting. And I do think we also need to try and link up with the US student learning type work. It tends to be two very separate literatures. So I think that's a useful piece of work to do, absolutely. We can talk more.
Yes? Go ahead.
What does your work tell us about the ability of students at graduation to judge the value of their courses?
That's a loaded question, but it's such a good one. Yeah, I think it's limited because they don't know what the world is like out there. I mean, the problem is the whole, I'm going to blame it on human capital theory, but the idea is that the person walks out ready to deliver value day one in the workplace. I mean, that's just all nonsense. The workplace is a different context to formal education. In these degrees, I don't want to valorize it too much, because I think our graduates do limp out a little bit. And I think that's not necessary, for example. There's a lot of logic around how engineering degrees work. They pride themselves on failing lots of people. And I think that's actually quite problematic. And it's really possible to shift the logic. But even then, I don't think you don't know what you're going to do with it. Of course, the key thing, which I haven't reflected here, but I did also in the seminar on Monday, I did ask students, what courses have you used from your undergrad degree in your work plan? You know what the answer is, like, not a lot. They say, oh, that course you taught us, which is, as you know, I'm not an engineer, it's like basic science at the start of second year. And some of the business stuff from fourth year. So, but no one's in higher education should be worried about that. It's not just training for a job. It's a higher education. So I think the thing, though, about how it formed them that really interests me in terms of people a student working in Botswana, and I think a little bit of his quote there, he said he's working in a big mine. He said, there are two of us who are university graduates, he might have said UCT graduates, but anyway, university graduates, we're the people who solve problems. Everyone else in the whole company, when something breaks, they phone the supplier in Europe and tell them to send out guys to fix it. We are people who can take the problem, take responsibility, see it through. Now, that's not a uniquely engineering thing. You could imagine that many different kind of workplace, the issue for public sector is really, really interesting for us. So that's the next piece. I went off on a tangent, but I like your question. Yeah.
Anyone else? Yes.
Can I just ask, you use the Archer framework. Did you start with that, or did you start with it later?
So I can quote you some nice person who can say you can, broadly it's critical social realism. You don't need to collect your data knowing exactly what you're going to do with it. So, yeah, how did I get here? Well, we were mentioning a colleague, Kevin Williams at UC2, who really had a very good grasp of this theory and I was working with, and who sort of said to me, you must read some Archer. To be honest, I got interested. The book I wrote because I knew I needed to do work to understand Archer. So writing a book sort of made sense. So it's very much that kind of a book. I think it's of more interest to like a PhD student than necessarily like some top sociologist. I mean, in a way, I'm really just working through the concepts for myself and seeing where they go. I don't want to become like a Archer fanaticist. Well, I've never wanted to join any sort of club. And there are all sorts of fads that go through the academic world. So, obviously, if you write this book and you say, I want to go, this is my whole story. But I really think we need, and I mean to reference Paul's book, which I mentioned on Monday as well. We need different angles. We need to be able to bring them in cleverly. Because you can't be naive. You've got to think about, the ontological and epistemological basis of what you're doing. But I'm also not... I can't dismiss everything that's done with a sort of interpretivist lens. I mean, I think it's really, really valuable. And I can see the value of some, positivist takes on the social world. So you can weave things together. Nice question.
Jenni, can I abuse my position as chair and ask you a question? Do you think Archer's reflexive imperative is to do with some kind of... element of the human condition? So we all have this notion that, or potential for being reflexive, and as part of existing in an alienated environment, which kind of disables you from being reflexive. I mean, I'm giving it a particular gloss, but do you think that's the kind of thing she was getting at, or do you think have you got a different take on the notion of an imperative in that sense?
What do you mean by the imperative? Yeah. No, look, so if I get you right, I mean, the argument would be humans have always been reflexive. Yeah. Her argument is that communicative reflexivity in modernity even was a fairly functional way of operating. And the way, prior to accelerated globalization and so on, a lot of people worked in that kind of mode, but with shift in economic realities and social realities, many more people. So the imperative is that, I guess, the social circumstances are forcing people, they're just not succeeding with communicative reflexivity. It also is related, and in fact, self-authorship's got a version of talking about this. They talk about dissonance, but if you are shifted, if you have a break in your natal context, if you have a social dislocation, we shouldn't be surprised in a way. I mean, there'd be other CESWE students who would have been orphaned and not managed to craft a way through the world. But on the other hand, which is what Delia and I argued way back before we even knew about Archer, this young man, there were the enormous resources that actually he built up really early on in his school career that actually made him be able to navigate engineering with some ease compared to some other students. Am I getting to your...
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit like a kind of Locke or Hobbesian sort of, view, there's something essentially human about our potential to be reflexive.
Yes.
And yet it's part of being in a capitalist state that kind of disables it. It's that kind of thing. I mean, I think she is talking in those terms, but I mean, that's... Okay, sorry about my abuse of the chair. I think we've got time. No, we haven't. So, thank you very much, Jenni.
Thank you.